can have. If one of our panelists is not on screen, please join us on screen as we start today. Welcome, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining our panel on a very, very important topic, which is about knowing our rights and unpacking the protests that are happening across the country today in relation to police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement. We have a very, very special panel with us today. We have a Black-led conversation, which is essential in these times in understanding what's going on, and we need to hear from their voices. So we're really happy to have all of you here. My name is Hannah. I am an intern and volunteer with CAIR, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. We have a really great conversation going. So I'm going to introduce our panelists really quickly. First up, we got Nima connecting, beautiful. Nima's actually at a DC protest right now, so she is pulling through with that phone call to talk about this discussion and join us. So we'll start with introducing our panelists. We have Anissa Ingram, who's an education major at the University of Maryland and a public policy minor. She is very well read and well versed on a lot of these issues. Next, we have Aliyah Abdulmanik, who is a youth activist and an information science and government and politics major at the University of Maryland as well. We have Omar Mukhtar Rashid, and he is actually a student member of the Board of Education. Correct me if I'm wrong, where are you? In
Baltimore.
Which county? In Baltimore County, perfect. So we have his perspective here as well. We also have Edward Mitchell, who's CAIR's deputy director and attorney, so he knows a lot of things about knowing our rights at protests. His voice is very important here. And finally, we have Nima Nael, who is a youth activist as well. And again, like I said, she is joining us from a protest. Nima, I don't know if you can hear us well. I want to make sure everything's good on your end. You'll let us know. And she's a junior international business major at Howard University and a dental hygiene student at Howard Community College. So with all of that being said, as you can see, we have a very diverse panel of voices. And with that, we'll get started with our conversation. I want to start by going around the panel and getting your initial reactions to the protests that happened in Minnesota. I want to hear what your reaction was when you heard about it, but also give us the context. Like, we know that police brutality is not anything new in America. So with that context, I want to hear your reactions as the protests became news that was widespread across America. So we can start with Anissa.
I guess it wasn't a shock. I think you have to come from a place of privilege if you see what's going on and say, oh, how did we get here, or what happened? So I think it's a necessary thing that needed to happen, and it has consistently happened in history. So it was kind of just something that was bound to happen in a sense. So it wasn't necessarily shocking, but it's just shocking to always remember that we're still in this place when we've been fighting this for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And our panelists, please feel free to join in. Aliyah, I'd like to hear your reactions as it.
Yeah, I guess for me, it was just kind of like everything was happening so fast. Like last week, the videos were resurfacing with Ahmaud Arbery, and that was itself just like one thing that was happening, and then the next week now we're on this, and it's just like happening all so fast, but I think kind of unnecessary in my opinion. Well, yeah, I'm concerned about like coronavirus and like staying safe. I feel like this was something that, you know, with everything that we're seeing, it was kind of bound to happen, and especially like in this way, the way that it's happening, the way people are reacting. Yeah, so for me, it was like I kind of expected.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Ahmad? What do you think?
For me, I was more of like scared and furious at the same time. Watching the videos, I felt as if like, especially for George Floyd, like I felt like one of like my brothers, like I felt like I knew him, and that it was like someone I knew being like asking for ale, begging for his mom. Like, it just really hurt. I actually didn't finish watching the video because it just hurt, like watching the video, watching someone getting murdered, and there's nothing I could like possibly do about it. So it just hurts. It was scary too. Yeah.
For sure. And Edward, do you have anything to add to what our panelists have said so far?
Sure, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Let me just start by saying thank you to all of you for participating and hosting this program. Thank you for having me. It's awesome to see young people doing this work in the community so early. May Allah grant you all success in this life and the next, and reward you for your efforts. In terms of the question of my reaction to the protests themselves, it's somewhat frustrating because you kind of think to yourself, could this have, inshallah, all been avoided had the police just done what they were supposed to do, which was arrest the officers who killed George Floyd the moment they saw the video. Now, of course, as Muslims, what happened by the decree of Allah, and it's done. So I'm not saying, questioning what if, but I'm just saying, the police officers, if the prosecutors had done what they had done, it makes you wonder whether or not people would have felt the need to protest in such a widespread way, or if people would have felt the need to be so angry and in some cases so destructive while protesting. The police still have not arrested 3 of the officers. And so that also begs the question, if they would just arrest the remaining officers, would things calm down, or is it too late? Is the genie out of the bottle, so to speak? So in terms of the protests themselves, not surprised and a little frustrated, not at the protesters, but at the prosecutors who failed to do what they should have done on day one, which is arrest the men who killed George Floyd.
Nima, we got Nima joining on the front lines. Thank you for adding that, Edward.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Nima. What's up? I don't know if you heard the
Assalamualaikum.
question. Walaikum assalam. I don't know if you heard the question, but we just went around the panel and got everyone's initial reactions to the protests and what happened to George Floyd to cause the protest. So if you could share your initial reactions, what happened?
So I did hear the question. I heard everyone's response. So first, I'd like to say thanks for having me here. It's really great to hear all of your responses. But so I guess my initial reaction was like, obviously, the constant emotions of like disgust, like wow, again. It's kind of numbing. But I think when I saw everyone's reaction, it was really awe-inspiring, because it's a very similar feeling to what was happening in Sudan last year. And I was like lucky enough to be there in Sudan last year. And the way that the protest is moving, the way that it's picking up pace in every single state is so amazing to see. And it's giving me hope. As someone who just recently lost hope in the movement because of the way that it was so slowly moving, and the way that Black lives were constantly being put in danger and constantly being lost to no one's care, to this desensitivity of the entire nation. This is something that's really amazing to see, and I'm really excited to be a part of another revolution.
Great, and that leads to our next question, which is, why is it important that these protests are happening now, knowing that we've had so many protests before? So in all of your opinions, what has to happen now that's different from what we've seen before in order to really foster some change? Omar, we can start with you.
So what's with the point where what's different now? I think now we can easily reach like millions of people within hours. As you saw, like if an incident happens, it probably took 2 hours for us to reach millions of people, dozens of states. It's even past our nation. It's worldwide at this point. And I think that we just need to keep protesting, expressing our demands for authorities to stop the abuse of power, to stop killing our men, to stop killing our Black people. And they need to know that we won't stop fighting back until this is done. But in the end, I believe that it lies with the power of our government officials, our elected officials. So I would say in the end, it would lie with us going to the polls and showing our frustration and the change we want to see with the people we elect.
For me, I feel like it really brought me back to Ferguson and Trayvon Martin and Freddie Gray, and when all those protests and riots were happening, what I'm seeing now, it seems like a flashback of that. So I feel like when those are happening, in the moment we're like, yes, we're rioting, we're protesting, we're doing what we can. And then I feel like 2 months, the riots and the protests started slowing down and things went back to how they were, which obviously I knew it wasn't going to switch like that. But I feel like this time what I think is important is, yes, participate in the protest or the riots, have your voice be heard. I know everyone's angry and we're seeing these things and you want to get it out, but also we need to focus on sustaining this energy, so it's not something that we just forget when November comes around, or we forget when there's a new, it's something that we have to remember. And then once you sustain that energy, you start organizing around it. So start working within your communities. There are already so many like organizers that have been doing like amazing work. So I think like getting in contact with them and like looking up causes that you want to be part of to sustain this. And then we can like deconstruct all the things that we're talking about. But I feel like if we want to change it, we really have to not just partake when it's all like hot and trendy. It's yeah, which I know is hard, but yeah.
Yeah.
I can go next. I think the main thing that we have to look at is definitely a lot of the times when we're discussing racism are just police brutality. In a sense, we're always talking about feelings and changing emotions, like trying to convince a police officer that a black life matters. But it's not necessarily that. It's looking at the policy of policing and how it continues to function, and allowing officers to kill Black people and get away with it and not be held accountable. And it's an ongoing thing. So unless you confront the fact that police officers are allowed to get away with this on a daily basis, even if there's a video of it happening, I think you have to focus on that root cause rather than just focusing on, okay, I need to go convince so-and-so in the police department that I'm valued. Because everyone, we know that we're valued, we know that we're human, but I don't really care if so-and-so thinks that if there's a policy in place that doesn't protect me in a sense of being a human. Mm-hmm.
For sure. And
I
Edward
think
and
that's
Nima, go ahead, Aaliyah.
I'm sorry. I just think that's like a really good point that Anissa brought up, is that like a lot of what we're seeing, it's already like ingrained in the laws and policies. So it's not like it's accidental is what I'm trying to say. Like, it's not like, oh, like this just so happened. It's a coincidence that all these Black people are dying. It's like, it's made to work this way. So I feel like we really do have to start questioning, you know, the police, the prosecutors, the, you know, all of these things are part of the issue that we're seeing.
Definitely. And Edward and Nima, please feel free to chime in. I want to talk a little bit about the context, and it's unfortunate that we have to ask this question, but a lot of non-Black people will look at what's happening without knowing the history of how the police force was used to oppress Black people, historically and until now. So if you all could talk about the context historically of why this is happening and why Black people specifically are suffering at the hands of police, to provide that context. Go ahead, Nima. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I was just gonna say that this is just real quick going back to the question before this. I think it's very valid to say that, you know, show up to the polls, but I also think honestly that there's no way in the system that was created to oppress Black people, in that system will there ever be peace, will there ever be justice. So I don't think it's a matter of going up to the polls because you're just voting for another white face or whatever face that's going to systematically continue this oppression. There's no way that one person in some office is going to be able to enact enough change for there to be a difference. So honestly, I think that the real changing point, the real point that's going to really enact some change is when we figure out a way to either completely rewrite the system or find a way where they come to us with a middle ground. It's not a time for us to be asking them for a place in their system. Now is the time for them to come to us and ask for a place in ours. It's not a matter of waiting for the next person with whatever promises they're going to have to take a 2-year position and then leaving us with more frustration, more deaths, and more disappointment in this very system that is systematically, I can't stress that enough, systematically designed to oppress us. There's no way that simple bandage fixes are ever going to change anything. But what was the second question was, how did we get here, right? Like, what is the context? What is the background? The background is that after slavery, I mean, I think most Black people to some point are educated about this, but just in case it wasn't, after slavery was abolished, there was then white people they couldn't wrap their minds around the idea that Black people were equal to them. And until now, they can't wrap their minds around that idea. So when they put them in, you know, their segregation, the penal system, every single policy from the Constitution down to states' constitutions, every single policy was made in order to keep Black people separate and below white people. And then once you give, you know, this huge amount of power to people that are only trained for 8 weeks, and then you expect them to go out and enact change without changing the system, the foundation that affects the way that they treat and interact with Black people, people of color, there's no way that, like, this is literally built to put Black lives in danger every single second, minute that they're outside. Even if they're in their own homes, they're able, like, the amount of power that we give police officers without any sort of, you know, training or any sort of like psychological checks. The fact that half of the Baltimore PD is also part of the Ku Klux Klan is unacceptable. And the Baltimore PD is not like ignorant of this. They know it. They just told them, you know, be on the low, but obviously they're not going to be. So there's no way that we can sit here and say that, oh, you know, go ahead and vote in the next election. You guys will see change the next term. It's really a time for systematic bottom to top eradication of the system and starting with a new one.
And I think also going off of that, along with looking at the root of slavery, but then also looking at the root of race. Like we never really discussed that. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, he has a statement that he says that racism is the father of race, not the son. So a lot of times we think racism comes from race, but race was created to uphold white supremacy and whiteness. That's why it was created. They needed an excuse to oppress Black people or enslave Black people, and that had to be done through justifying it through Christianity or different things, but they created it for exactly that. So you can't have race without racism. So no, understanding that root cause and then breaking it down from there is really important, and just acknowledging that the reason all this is so confusing and it just doesn't make sense is because it's a social construct and it was created. Do we have to deal with the repercussions of it now? Absolutely. But it's really important to know that root cause of everything in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Aaliyah and Omar, yeah, go ahead.
And I agree with Nima. Like from the very start, like so many of this country's like laws and public like policies were like changed explicitly like prevent people of color from fully participating. So I agree with her saying that, hey, like taking it to the polls isn't just like isn't like the main way to like get rid of like what's going on, and that we can't change it from office by every office, and that would take forever. So I definitely agree with Nima that we have to change like the system as a whole and rewrite the way that things are done.
Mm-hmm. Also, just 2 quick points to like Nima's point about like the presidents, whatever. A lot of people were outraged because of what Trump said about like thugs, and you know, once the looting starts, the shooting starts. And obviously, like I'm just as outraged. Like, so you use the words thugs when he's talking about Black protesters, but then like last week when he was talking about the white protesters, it's a much nicer, friendlier terms. It's obvious racism, but we also have to remember Obama was saying similar things when Ferguson was happening and, you know, all those riots were happening. He was calling Black people criminals and, you know, saying that we shouldn't be like destroying our cities when we don't own anything. We don't actually have anything attached to the city other than the fact that we live here. So yeah, I just want to like keep that in mind, that like different parties, like the Democrat Party and the Republicans, they basically act the same way. And really, like, to say that Biden and we have to get Trump out, like, of course we don't want Trump, but I think the conversation has to be bigger than just the president. And, you know, and then I feel like that's how you kind of organize. When you start organizing around like this is bigger than that, I feel like is how you can sustain it, because November comes and we don't see change, then we're going to be back at zero. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the thought, first of all, it's just wonderful to listen to you all think about these issues and talk it out. I mean, alhamdulillah, may Allah increase all of you in wisdom and knowledge. The one thought I would share is, you know, I've heard this point made, and it's a very important point, that the system itself, especially when it comes to law enforcement and criminal justice, is designed in a way that is inherently unjust, and that if you just try to tweak the system, there will still be injustice. And of course, we know as Muslims, when you have any sort of system that is disconnected from God, there will be problems and injustice, right? But even beyond that, even within the realm of the secular, it's still a deeply flawed system. But then the question becomes, how do you change the system, right? I don't think it makes sense to say, and I don't think anyone here has said this, but I think you have to keep in mind that the easiest way, the best way, perhaps the only way ultimately to really change the system is at the end of the day voting. We can have all the nice protests we want. We can fill the streets. We can influence the media. But at the end of the day, the people sitting in Congress and the White House make the laws. They make the laws determining who goes to jail for what. They make the decisions about who's getting prosecuted for what. They make the decisions about how long a sentence is for crimes that, for example, African Americans might be more likely to commit compared to white Americans. All of that is decided by people in elected office. In order to change the policies those people implement, you have to either convince them to change, right? That's through lobbying, activism, outreach, protesting. And if that doesn't work, then you have to replace them with other people in office. And that is what is unique about America, is that our system, the one thing about our system that does work relatively well, is that it gives you the opportunity to change the policies of our government without having to resort to anarchy, to violence, to war, right? In some countries, if you want to change your government's policies, too bad. You speak up, you're going into the bottom of the prison, and you can go out and protest, but you might end up getting shot or run down, right? You don't have the option to try to change the system. In our country, every 2 years, every 4 years, you do get an opportunity to change the system. The change might be incremental. There may not always be a big difference between this president and that president, this Congress and that Congress, but the difference can change lives. It can save lives. It can harm lives. So I think you all are absolutely right. The system itself is flawed, but just keep in mind, ultimately, you young people especially have got to vote. All these people out here protesting, I hope that those people also take the time to vote, because that is just as important as coming out in the streets to protest.
If not more important.
Yeah. And I think piggybacking off of that as well, to say that there's a combination of that there's flaws in the system is also to acknowledge that even though there are flaws and there's yet to be an eradication of the system in a sense, to get to have gotten to this point, it's because of legislators and policymakers that have gone in and have been voted in a sense to get us to this place. And as you were saying, it is incremental, so it's not just a quick boom, but it is a process that has, to an extent, progressed us up to this point. So to acknowledge that as well, and that voting is important, and too, but then also acknowledging that there is a systematic function that needs to be confronted to. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that draws to the point of the importance of local elections even, because local elections is where young people can have the biggest impact, I would argue, where you can really understand who is heading the police station, like who is in charge of the police force in your area, like who is the attorney in your state, the attorney general of your state. These are the people making the decisions about how the police are getting prosecuted ultimately, and that's a place where we could have a lot of impact, is in those local elections. But you all are bringing up very important points about the system being designed to oppress and be oppressive towards Black people. So let's turn into this question now, before we get into knowing our rights at protests that are protected. Let's talk about how we can transform our pain into passion, and that passion into purpose. So we talked about voting. What other ways are constructive for us to be able to solve this issue? And I want to talk specifically about how non-Black people can support Black liberation. What are ways that we can implement so that we can eradicate the oppression that's happening across the country? And that's a big question, y'all. I know that's a big question, but I'd love to hear what you believe is a way for that, because I can speak from experience of being Palestinian, that when people who are not Palestinian talk about the cause, it draws more attention than the people who are actually being oppressed. And so knowing that, what are tools that you can give non-Black people or tell non-Black people to do to support you and to make sure that we, get rid of this oppression and actually have, liberation and equality?
Mm-hmm. I'll go real quick. I think it's first acknowledging that there is an issue, but second, it's acknowledging that Black people have been on the front lines since the beginning of this country. A lot of the times, like I'll relate it to slavery. It's always the saying that Abraham Lincoln abolished slavery, but it wasn't just Abraham Lincoln. It was the slaves that emancipated and decided to, join the Union Army. It was the fact that they put in the work, and abolitionists, to eradicate slavery. It wasn't just Abraham Lincoln who gets the picture and glory of erasing slavery and stuff like that. So it's first acknowledging that there are organizations and leaders and individuals who are putting in the work every single day. So to say, I think it's also flawed to say that after all of this, we don't do anything. I think that's when you have to look in the mirror and say, am I doing anything? Because there are people who are doing stuff every single day. They're committing their lives to it. They're committing their occupations to it. And so it's first looking at yourself and saying, how can I be a resource to these organizations that are already putting in the work every single day and support the businesses, like I said, the organizations that are working on this stuff day and night.
Mm-hmm. And follow Black-led initiatives. I feel like that's super important, you know. But let's keep it going. Aaliyah, Omar, Nima, what do we think?
I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I'll let them go first.
You've been good. Everyone's been talking a great amount. Omar, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I would say that for people that non-colored people, I would say that one amazing way, the main way that most people I know have been doing it is by raising awareness. I know that it matters, like especially people with like huge platforms, like people like Tom Brady, when they reach out to everyone and tell them about the issues that are going on, and it's not just coming from us. I feel like people will listen to it more, like you said about the whole Palestinian case and everything. I feel like that's like the most people can do, because right now, unless there are people in power that can actually make changes, the best way to do it, like right now, is with these protests, everything that's going on, is by like raising awareness, letting people know, hey, like this isn't okay, like we're all in this together, like this is a humanity problem, not just like a Black people problem, but they're the ones being affected the most right now, so we need to help them out. So definitely raising awareness and speaking out is the main ways I see right now for non-colored people to help out.
Going off that, I feel like, yeah, raising awareness is important, but also being careful with like how you're raising awareness, just making sure that it's like sincere and actually productive, because I've seen this trend on Instagram. You guys probably seen it, like Black Scream, tag 10 people if Black Lives Matter or something like that. I get the concept, like, but realistically, what is it actually doing? How are we bringing education to the issues going on? You know, how are we, you know, are we like, I just feel like something more effective would be just saying, these are like 10 organizations you can donate to, and try to match me, tag a person you want to match you. Something like that would be more effective. So when you're doing these things, make sure they're sincere, not just, you know, performative, like, look at me, like I care about Black lives, and then you go back to your life. And then kind of like, yeah, like I mentioned earlier, is donating. That's like a really big one, that if you're like afraid of like coronavirus and going out in public, organizations always need money. We need money now more than ever. So I feel like that could be something that everyone can do. Obviously not everyone can donate. Oh, sorry. Obviously not everyone can has the money to do that, but like if you could just spread that around, that would be very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely don't let it be a trend. Don't jump on any kind of bandwagon. Make sure that everything you're doing, first of all, is set your intention. And as Muslims, we really know about intention. I think we can all agree that we know about setting our intention, how important that is. It's half of your action. So before you do anything, I encourage every person who isn't Black, even Black people who feel that they're not as educated as they could be, do your research. Do as much research as you can. Allah gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. That's the proportion that we're supposed to use it with. Make sure that you're listening more than you're speaking, especially as non-Black people. You need to understand that, yes, this is a humanity issue. This is very clearly an inhumane thing that happened, but at the same time, this is not the time for you to try and make your voice specifically heard. Everyone's struggle is important, and every life matters, but not every life needs to be the forefront of every conversation. Right now, one of our houses, one of our communities is on fire, and it's not the time for you to say, well, listen, I have a problem as well. Well, listen, I want to say something about this. This is just the time to use every single platform that you have to elevate and amplify Black voices, to make sure that you're putting Black people of color at the forefront of every conversation, making sure that you're asking them for their input before you're doing things, publicly. And at the same time, like I said, just do as much research as you can. Donation's important, but make sure you're not donating to, something that one of your creators posted that you think is great. Oh, I love this creator, they posted this, I'm going to donate here. And then the whole time it's actually a white supremacy organization that's just funneling money into the same issues that we're fighting every single day. So I'd say do your research, make sure you amplify people of color's voices first before your own, and just be respectful and check your privilege all the time. Check your privilege all the time.
Mm-hmm. Adding to that, about research, I feel like a lot of people sometimes, especially younger people that are like in college, think, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be educated, have it all together, know everything. No, now's the time that you ask questions. Now the time, especially like now, like it's so critical that we're looking up, history, and, there's so much in history that we can look back on to use now. So I feel like just doing your research and looking back And yes, I know a lot of non-Black people might be inclined to ask their Black friends, like, oh, like, what's going on here? Like, why is that wrong? What is this? You know, which it's not a bad thing per se. I understand the intentions are good and they're genuine, but just be mindful that like your Black friends are also going through a lot right now. Like seeing the news every single day, that's a lot to handle. So if you could just, you know, sometimes try to do like your own independent research, and then if you know that someone can handle it, or if somebody is like willing and inviting you to, then that's the time. But like just be mindful of that. And you know, yeah.
Definitely. And we did have a comment from one of our viewers who talked about needing an overall effort to make true change. So that includes political and social activism, policymaking, voting, lobbying, more Black people running for Congress, becoming judges. All these things are very important and in the effort to end this oppression. And so we wanted to acknowledge that comment. And now I think we can transition into our rights and knowing what our rights are when we protest. And Edward, this was where we'll need your expertise to help break this down for us. So can you quickly go over what our rights are as protesters? And specifically, what happens if we are arrested? What are the steps? What are our rights? And what is the police allowed to do and not allowed to do when they're attempting to arrest us or interact with us as we're protesting in the streets?
Okay, inshallah. So ask me some of those questions again as I talk if I miss anything, inshallah. So first, obviously, the right to peaceably assemble is guaranteed by the First Amendment of the Constitution. So it's not like a law that Congress passed saying you have the right to protest. That is in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that you have the right to peacefully assemble, the right to protest, to petition your government, right? So that's a basic fundamental part of living in America. And I don't even say being an American, because that applies to anyone in America has the right to protest. It doesn't matter if you're a citizen, lawful permanent resident, or even here undocumented. You're on American soil, you have the right to protest, to peacefully assemble. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean you can show up anywhere in America, go in your neighbor's front yard, go in the middle of the street, go on the sidewalk? You know, what does that mean? What are the limits to it? And what happens when you end up interacting with law enforcement in a positive or negative way? What happens if you're organizing a protest? What happens if you're just participating in a protest? Let's talk about those issues, inshallah. So first, let's talk about if you are organizing a protest. That is, you decided you want to oversee a protest. What are some of the things that you should keep in mind? Alhamdulillah, I've been in many protests. I've helped organize many protests in recent years. It's always nerve-wracking. It's somewhat stressful. You're dealing with so many different moving parts, so many different people involved. But alhamdulillah, if you are working with people who know what they're doing, it turns out well, usually in the end, inshallah. So the first thing I would say is when you're planning a protest, if it's your first time doing it, pull in someone who has done it before, right? Partner with an organization, individuals in the community leaders who have done this before, who know the ins and outs, at least get guidance from them. Don't just walk into it all on your own, having never done it before. Not saying you can do that, but it's really a good idea if you get some guidance to help walk you through the process, to make sure that you're not missing anything, to make sure that you're thinking everything through, to make sure that everything goes off as well as you want it to go. So that's the first piece of advice I would give. The second thing to note is you've got to understand, if you are organizing the protest, you need to understand what your legal rights are, what the legal rights of your protesters are. So number one, public property versus private property. If you are on public property, what is public property? Public property is property that is owned by the government, as opposed to private property, which is property owned by an individual. For example, a business, an individual person. So for example, a few days ago, we saw protesters at the CNN Center in Atlanta. Can anyone tell me, would that be a protest on public or private property?
Private.
Private property, right? CNN is a private news outlet, okay? Now, on the other hand, you had protests in Minneapolis at the 3rd Police Precinct, 3rd District Precinct, and they burned that building down. Public property, private property?
Public.
Public, government building. Okay, yes, very good. So there's a difference, right? If you are on public property, by law, you are generally allowed to be there with some exceptions, some of the major ones. If you're on a sidewalk, you're protesting or marching, you're fine, unless you are blocking the entire road, the entire sidewalk, or if your group is so large that you would be blocking traffic or going off the sidewalk into the road. In a case like that, you will likely need to have a permit beforehand from the city or the state that would allow you to engage in that sort of protest. And they will have to give you that permit, but they have all sorts of rules, hoops you follow through. You submit an application, there may be a fee, which you may not have to pay at all. You may have to do it within a certain amount of time. But if you want to avoid the permit thing, the thing to remember is you should be on the sidewalk. That's public property. You can't block the entire sidewalk, and you cannot go into the road, and you cannot block pedestrian traffic, just legally. Now, practically speaking, I've been in many protests where people were in the road, people were in the were blocking crosswalks for a period of time, and the police just let it go because there were so many people. The crowd was moving, the crowd was marching, and there was no easy way for them to confront all of us. So when I say legally, that's what you're supposed to do. That is what you're supposed to do. But practically speaking, let's say, something horrible happens and your community just wants to get out and protest the very next day, and there's not time to get a permit, there's not time to jump through all those hoops. You can still go out and protest. You might get some pushback from the police, but generally, as long as you keep it moving, you're not blocking traffic for too long, there shouldn't be an issue. But it's always better if you're going to be in that situation to get a permit in advance so you don't have those sorts of conflicts with the police. Another thing to do, make sure that you've got volunteers assigned to corral, that is to keep control of the crowd, especially if you've got a large crowd. They should be wearing something that identifies them as volunteers. Could be orange traffic vests, could be a particular shirt with a design on it, but give that authority to people, like a team of people who are helping to guide the crowd. You don't want to just be you're leading the protest and there's no one else helping you organize, guide things. You don't just have one person with hundreds of people, doing whatever, because they won't all be able to see what you're doing. They won't be able to hear you. You need to have guides who are keeping people safe, making sure whoever needs water, making sure that people are staying out of the road, etc., and also making sure that people are staying on point with the messaging, the chanting, etc. Another thing, if you can, it's a really good idea to have a point person named who will handle interactions with the police. And it will be great if that person is a lawyer or some sort of experienced civil rights activist. That way, if there is some conflict with the police, they're not grabbing or interacting with random people. They have a central person that can address the issue with them and keep the police keep the police's attention and address the issue with them while people carry on with the march. So that's another thing. If you can't appoint a point person, do that. You don't have to, but it's a great idea to do that in case issues come up. Number two, you have the right to protest on public property, but so do counter-protesters. So if you're holding a Black Lives Matter protest for Palestine, whatever it is, and counter-protesters show up, they got the right to protest too. Now, they don't have the right to try to stop you from speaking through physical interference. They don't have the right to try to lay hands on you, do anything like that. They don't have that right, but they do have the right to chant. They do have the right to try to chant loud, to drown you out. That's the back and forth that happens, right? So keep that in mind. You've got the right to protest on public property, so do they. Another thing, you've got the right on public property to film and record anything in view. That is fine, right? Now, that doesn't mean that if you're protesting outside of a closed office building, well, you can force your way into the building and start filming things, right? No, you don't have that right? That's trespassing, right? But anything that's in view, building, street, people, a police officer interacting with you, a police officer talking to you, you can hold up your camera, you can film them, you can photograph them, you have that right. And they cannot tell you not to do that. The only way they could stop you from doing that is if they are detaining you, arresting you, then they can make you stop doing that. Anyone see the CNN reporters being arrested in Minneapolis a few days ago?
Yeah.
You guys see that? So yes, you'll notice they told them, put the camera down. They helped them put the camera down, and they arrested them. So even though they were journalists, even though they were reporters, once the police decide you're going to be arrested, they do have the right to try to take everything out of your hands and to arrest you. That doesn't mean that what they're doing is right. It could still be illegal. You might have to file a lawsuit later, file a complaint. You might have a protest about what they did. But once they make that decision, right, you don't want to fight with them. You don't want to get into a physical altercation. You do have to obey the order at that point, once they decide and to tell you are under arrest. But up until that point, you can photograph, film. You can even keep your camera on and put it down so that it's still recording things while you are filming. Another thing to keep in mind, with big protests, you may need to use microphones, bullhorns, or like portable sound equipment. That's fine, but if you use that, that may trigger certain laws that apply to your protest. If you're not using sound equipment, for example, you may not need to get a permit. You may not need to jump through those hoops. But if you are using sound equipment, you may need to then get a permit. It all depends on the local laws in your city or your state. Finally, the thing about public property is if you are standing in one fixed place for an extended period of time, there could be some local rules that impact whether or not you need a permit. So just keep in mind that it's a good idea to have someone who's an expert, someone who can understand what your protest plan is and then give you guidance about how it will work, what issues you need to be aware of in your local community. Now, on the other hand, private property. You do not have the legal right to go onto private property to protest without permission of the property owner. Now, do people still do it? Yeah. Does it always end badly? No, of course not. Sometimes people just, the owner may just let it happen. The owner may not be there. Sometimes we've had protests at embassies, right, which are foreign government buildings. People may, get very close to the embassy, maybe even go onto the embassy grounds to protest, and then they leave, right? So, yeah, I'm just telling you what the rules are, but sometimes people don't actually, uphold the rules. Sometimes something bad doesn't have to violate them. But as Muslims, we want to follow the law, follow the rules. And the rule is private property. You don't have the right to go on anyone's private property without the permission of the property owner. Now, if you're the private property owner is part of your protest, is welcoming you on to protest, you've got the right to be there, and no one outside can tell you to stop, right? So, for example, if you're on private property, you're holding a protest, the police can come to you and say, hey, what are you doing? Do you have a permit? No, you don't need a permit. You're on private property. You're not on public property. The police have nothing to say about what you're doing on private property, unless you're creating a noise nuisance or something like that. You follow me? So just keep that difference in mind between private property and public property. If you're having a normal protest, that should be happening on public property unless you've got permission to be on private property.
Now, Edward, I want to quickly ask you, what happens if a police officer decides to arrest you at a protest? What are your rights during the arrest and after the arrest?
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So let's say that's my next point. So let's say you're having a negative interaction with the police, and let's say this escalates to the point that the police have decided to arrest you. So look, hopefully it doesn't come to that. Some people, when they're protesting, will deliberately be arrested. For example, the police may issue an order, disperse, or you'll be arrested. Many protesters will intentionally, they'll stand in the streets, they'll put their hands up, and they will know they're going to be arrested, but that's part of the protest. That's part of the act of civil disobedience. They are deliberately disobeying the order, and they're willing to face the consequences. Dr. Martin Luther King did that. Many civil rights activists did that, deliberately disobeying an order, but with the understanding that you are going to be arrested and you're not going to fight back. You will accept being arrested and deal with the consequences that comes with it. So let's say you're being arrested. Number one, if you can, either ask for or look and get the name of the person arresting you, right? Number two, if there are other people around who are not being arrested, right? Make sure they can take your property from your cell phone, your keys, or whatever, if they have the chance to do that. They may not get the chance to do that, but you can ask the officers, can I give my stuff to, the people around me? Number three, again, you can film the officers, but once they decide to arrest you, you've got to put your camera down. You've got to submit to the arrest. You can't refuse to do that once they've decided to arrest you. Once you are taken into custody, if this is a protest, like an act of civil disobedience, usually they'll put you in what's called a plastic zip tie, not even handcuffs, plastic zip tie. They'll take you away from the protest. Usually the process is pretty quick. You may not even be taken to jail. You may just be released with a ticket, a citation after they've taken you away. If they do take you to jail, most likely you would then be sitting in jail with people who've committed low-level offenses, minor offenses, and likely go before a judge either the same day or at latest the next day. And because it's not considered a serious offense, you'd most likely be released without having to have your family pay anything, most likely. But there may be some sort of bond that you'd have to pay. That is the payment you have to pay to the court in order to get out so that they know you're coming back. So essentially, the other thing to keep in mind if you're arrested, this is an issue we've seen with Muslim women in particular, is the issue of hijab. If you're arrested while wearing a hijab, some districts, some cities already protect your right to keep your hijab on when you go to jail. They may let you keep it on your photograph when you get your booking photograph. But some jurisdictions, they don't have that rule yet. They may still refuse to let women wear hijab. So if you are taken to jail and they want to take your hijab off, you should object. Obviously, you should say, no, I'm wearing it for religious reasons and I do not agree to take it off. They may still ultimately force you to take it off, but if they do that, we would argue they are violating the law and opening themselves up to a major lawsuit. So if that happens, obviously contact CAIR or another civil rights group immediately so that we can deal with that police department and try to make sure that, number one, you are made whole for the loss, the difficulty you suffered, but also make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else again. So there are just some things to keep in mind if you are arrested by the police. Again, you can photograph, you can film up to the point of being arrested, get their names. Afterwards, if something inappropriate was done to you, file a complaint, but don't fight, don't get into a physical altercation with officers. That is not a safe or acceptable thing to do. Do not do that. But make sure you protest, make sure you stand up for yourself. And if someone does something inappropriate to you, please let us know so that we can file a complaint, take legal action, go public with that afterwards. So finally, last thing I'll say about protesting, then I'll let it go, is make sure that if you're participating in a protest, not organizing, but if you're participating in a protest, make sure you stay on message with what the organizers have laid out, right? Make sure that whatever the message is they have said, this is our goal, this is our message. Don't show up at someone else's protest and undermine the message they've laid out, right? Don't say something that contradicts the message, the goal that they have, right? Follow the lead of those who organize the protest. Number two, bring a sign, right? If you can, that's always great to have a sign, or get a sign when you're there so that if you are photographed, it's not just you, but the message you want delivered. Bring water for yourself or other people if you can. Be very cognizant of safety. We've had incidents where people collapsed of heat exhaustion, things like that. So just be careful about that. And the last thing is, if you see something dangerous, if you see, for example, someone who seems like an infiltrator, someone about to do something dangerous, make sure to get away from them and let the organizers of the protest know. We had an incident at a protest, I think last year, where, we're peacefully protesting and this white man, a young man with his face covered in a hoodie wearing a backpack, there was some indication he may have had an explosive device or some sort of incendiary device that he was about to use, and we had to address that issue. I think we had security or someone address that issue. He was causing problems, but he didn't have an incendiary device. But just watch out for people. You do have infiltrators who come who try to do something crazy to make the other protesters look bad. You might also have someone who comes who just wants to hurt you, may want to hurt protesters. So be cognizant of that. They could be in a car, they could be on foot. Just keep your eye out for people doing anything dangerous. So I know that was a lot, but I hope that's helpful to you, inshallah.
Definitely. Thank you for breaking that down for us. Yeah, and we had a question from Facebook about what do I do if I'm organizing a protest and provokers show up, but you answered that really well in your explanation, so jazakallah khair for that. And I do want to point out that CAIR is in touch with attorneys who are offering pro bono representation and financial assistance for anyone who was arrested during a Black Lives Matter protest or a Justice for George Floyd protest being held in Maryland. And they can contact us at 410-971-6062 or mdoutreach@cair.com to learn more. We can send that information out as we conclude the webinar. So with that being said, and with the discussion that we've had, I want to end today in our last 10 minutes on some final reflections from our wonderful panel. And I want to know from your perspective what we can do today. We touched on this before, but maybe some more thoughts came to mind. What we can do today to help support Black lives and create justice in situations where it's not being served. So what's your final reflection, final tip for our audience? One thing they can do today as they leave the webinar and go back into their daily lives. Anyone can start.
Okay, I'll go.
Thanks, Anika.
I think the first thing, going off of just like learning all of the rights in general, a lot of the times, the way that it kind of like racist ideas function is they pit the blame on people rather than policies or the way that things function. So just as we need to know our rights, we need to ensure that we figure out how police know our rights. in a sense. So anyone can know they're right, but you're still going to be arrested. People are protesting and doing it so legally, but they're still going to be pepper sprayed. So I think it's really acknowledging what are the steps that we can take to confront policing and how it's been functioning, and how police officers can, well, the system in a sense, uphold citizens' rights while they're protesting or anything like that.
And Anissa, do you have a book recommendation for our audience?
Yes, no, I actually do. So I'm very excited about this book. I talk about it a lot. It's How to Be Anti-Racist. It's by Ibram Kendi. People probably talked about it a lot because it's very recent. It was in 2019. But I do say that that's a very valuable book that people could read and get a lot of knowledge from. It really allows you to kind of take a step back and confront different things in place that are in your mind, but then are also in society. So yeah, that's my recommendation.
All right, how to be an anti-racist?
Yes, How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Perfect. All right, everyone, let's get reading. Aaliyah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say to any Black people watching and just people of color, like right now it's like really hard, and so I wanted to quote Audre Lorde. One of my favorite quotes is, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political welfare." So really just take care of yourself during this time. Don't feel bad if you haven't been in the state of mind to like go to a protest and, you know, be out there. You just taking care of yourself and just being alive and well is the most important thing to us right now. We need everyone. So yeah, just take care. And yeah, a book I would recommend, the one that I'm reading right now, also by Audre Lorde, is Your Silence Will Not Protect You. So yeah.
Excellent. Let's keep the reflections going. Omar, you want to add to the discussion here?
Yeah, after like this whole panel, I would just say, you know your rights, speak up, and in the end, like Brother Edwards said, go out and vote for the representatives that you want to make the changes you want to see.
Gotcha. Edward and Nima, any final thoughts and reflections for our audience today?
Go ahead. Is Nima speaking? She may be on mute.
I think she is, but I think there's a lot going on. You know, she's on the front lines, so we'll give her a minute here.
Okay. All right. Very well. Well, yeah, I would just say, you know, I'm so happy to have been on this panel with you. It's great to hear these thoughts from you, the young generation, the next generation. I would just say, as parting advice, don't get cynical. Don't get pessimistic. You know, every generation has something crazy going on. In the 60s, young people saw the Vietnam War that led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans, the assassination of Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, Malcolm X. Horrible things happened. In the 1970s, you had Richard Nixon, you know, becoming president, and things getting even worse in terms of foreign policy. You saw the war on drugs and all these other things that started to begin. The 1980s, you had all sorts of difficulties. The 1990s, obviously the 2000s, Hurricane Katrina, 9/11, the economic collapse, the Great Recession. Every generation, there's something unexpected that happens, a challenge that a generation faces. So don't think the world is ending. It will one day, but inshallah, not right now. This is a challenge to be overcome, to be met, and to be met through our faith. That's the one key thing that I want to emphasize to all of you is make sure that whatever you do, whether you are speaking up for a cause, make sure that cause lines up with the values that we believe in. If you are advocating for a cause, make sure you're advocating for that cause in a way that lines up with the values of our faith. You don't have to be adopt the policies or the rhetoric or the practices of conservatives or liberals or Democrats or Republicans or anyone else. You get to be you. You get to be Muslim. So that is our guidepost, not anyone else's way of doing things. We argue for what is right in a way that is right, inshallah. So just keep that in mind as you continue this work, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So I would like to first give a book recommendation that I just recently read for like the millionth time. It's A Message to the Black Man by Elijah Muhammad. He's from the Nation of Islam. So, you know, as Muslims, it's important to recognize that our Black Muslims in America have had a huge impact on shaping and valuing the way that we're able and have the freedoms to express our faith. A lot of masajid were built on ground that the nation got during reparations and then gave to the Muslim community. So I think it's really important to understand that perspective. But first, the first thing I want to address is to all the Black people listening, just like Aaliyah said, understand that, you know, your voice, your perspective, your experience is not a monolith. The Black experience is not a monolith. Although it's important and necessary for us to stay united and maintain a united front, that doesn't mean everyone has to be out there yelling. That doesn't mean everyone has to be out there fighting, writing, whatever. You know, Black creators, take this time to, you know, take this time to read, write, paint, whatever you want, whatever you do. Dancers, painters, make sure that you're taking this time to understand and really reflect on your own perspective and your impact in the world, because it doesn't have to be the same as the ones that you see on the media. That's not, that just because that those are the ones that are propagated doesn't mean those are the only important ones. That's not to take away from their value, but it is very important that everyone is staying true to who they are and staying true to their own message, because the only way that we can ever lose is once we lose track of our mission. And the mission isn't to always be fighting for our lives. The mission is to exist within our lives, and the only way we can do that is by seeing what that looks like and knowing what it means. So yeah, that's all I'd like. And then for everyone who isn't Black, make sure, you know, like I said, check your privilege, use your platform for good, and amplify Black voices and experiences as much as you can. Donate, do your research, and just stay educated. So yeah, thanks for listening.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you to all of our panelists for providing that insight and final reflections. Aaliyah, did you want to add one more thing?
I was just gonna say thank you for like inviting me and having us. I think
Of course. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure. And on a final note, I do also want to say to all the non-Black people who are here today to normalize shaming racists and shaming racism, and making sure that it's not thriving in our homes, in our communities, in where we go to school, anywhere really. And that's part of where it starts. So again, I do want to thank our panelists for sharing your perspectives today. Aaliyah, if you could send your book title to the chat, because I missed it real quick, so our audience knows where they can read and educate themselves. Thank you so much for being here, for listening, for being a part of the fight against this oppression. And please follow up on what our panelists said. Take the steps that they talked about, and again, follow Black-led initiatives when they're talking about their own oppression. So thank you everyone for being here. Jazakallah khair for your insights, and we'll see you on the next webinar talking and dissecting these issues. Jazakallah khair, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Bye, everyone.
Wa alaikum assalam.